Welcome to Speaking Out.
We're mainly discussing land rights and economic empowerment.
Aboriginal enterprises in mining, exploration and energy.
I just talk a little bit about Indigenous constitutional recognition.
With Larissa Behrendt.
It's a fresh view coming
on ABC Radio.
So the first big factor is the failure to address the structural drivers that brings kids into contact with the child protection system. Issues like poverty and housing insecurity, physical and mental health of families, substance misuse, issues that are in many ways linked to intergenerational experiences of trauma, of social marginalisation, of economic marginalisation, and of forced removals.
The need to apply a cultural lens to child removal policies. This is Speaking Out. I'm Larissa Behrendt. Child protection policies came under renewed scrutiny last month as state and territory governments considered the latest draft of the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children. The framework is one of the first strategies to be developed under the latest Agreement on Closing the Gap and aims to reduce the overrepresentation of First Nations children in out-of-home care. Currently, they make up 41% of all kids in the system, and that figure is forecast to double within the decade. Experts have long argued that a community-led approach is needed to address the systemic issues around the removal and subsequent placements of First Nations children. It's also recognised that maintaining a connection to community, culture and kinship are vital to ensuring their health and well-being. Joining me now to discuss these issues in greater detail is Co-Chair of the Family Matters National Leadership Group, Dr. Paul Gray, Deputy Children's Guardian for Aboriginal Children and Young People in New South Wales, Richard Weston, and Catherine Little, CEO of the Secretariat of National Aboriginal and Islander Childcare, SNAIC, the national voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Prior to taking on her current role, Catherine has held a number of senior management positions with First Nations organisations. Richard, I'll start with you. You've had an extensive career in the community-controlled sector. What drew you into this line of work?
Well, I've been working in Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, Aboriginal affairs, for 28 years. So I've been drawn into working with our communities because I think it's primarily where I've felt most comfortable. It's where I've been welcomed. It's where I've found meaning in work, in spending 8 hours of my day in a workplace. You know, I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about myself. I've learned a lot about my own history and culture, learned a lot about Aboriginal culture and kinship. So I've grown as a person, and I think I've just had some, in the arc of that journey, that I've found some hopefulness that perhaps I can make a difference in the challenges that we face in overcoming the disadvantage in our people's lives and creating better futures. So I've had a pretty rich experience and a fortunate working life, and now I'm working in a sort of a government role, an independent role, to tackle this vexed issue of overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care.
And what about you, Catherine? You've come from working in other organisations. What's drawn you into this area and this space?
You know what? It's a really simple one for me, and that is that I'm a storyteller by trade. I've always framed my existence around understanding that if you have the ability to change a message, then that is the most powerful thing you can do. And the way I grew up, which was under grandmother's law, and grandmother's law is that, you have to care for all children. And if you care for all children, and if they know who loves them, if they know who feeds them, then they will grow up strong and well. That matches really, really closely to it. And one of the most powerful instruments that I was exposed to as part of grandmother's law growing up was what we call in my country money. And I'm sure a lot of other mob have a very similar tool, but money is the law. And that's where you sit down in the sand and the storyteller starts creating a story out of leaves, and those leaves adopt personalities, and those personalities frame a story that talks to you about how you treat other people and how you care for other people and what the consequences might be if you don't treat other people well. And what I learnt from that experience is that at any point in time, it is the storyteller that is the most powerful person in the room. They can make you cry, they can make you laugh, and they can teach you lessons that you might not necessarily have been prepared to hear before. So I think it was just a natural part of my journey that story, that ethos followed me into an area where I get to do both of those things, and that is find a career that consolidates my commitment to grandmother's law, but also uses those tools that I have learnt through many, many years of journalism and producing.
Thank you for that. There's some wonderful life lessons in that, some reflections for all of us in how you've framed your own story. So thank you. And what about you, Paul? What's led you into this space, which of course you've been in for quite some time too?
Yeah, thanks, Larissa. And, I think as both Catherine and Richard have said, everything starts and ends with family. That's where everything begins. So I'm the youngest in my family and come from a very close family, and my parents were always very involved in community, just participating and helping out with local schools and things like that. So I've always grown up with that set of values about doing your part for community. And I suppose the other key point for me was when I left home to go to university, my parents became foster carers, welcoming in young people into their homes who, were in the child protection system. And it was a real eye-opener for me just for what the reality is for those kids. And so ever since, I've sort of found myself just, continuing this work and really trying to shape a system that does better for them. And make sure that we live up to our obligations to look after all young people and to give them the best opportunities to thrive. So I feel like it's just now that's my responsibility in community is to do our best to shape better systems for our kids and our families.
It's great having that moment just to find a little bit more about all of you and where you're coming from and your worldview. I just want to ask a couple of questions now that will help frame what the big picture questions are in this area. And Paul, I just wonder from your perspective, if you could give us a snapshot of why the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care continues to increase.
Yeah, and that's a massive concern for us, Larissa, because it suggests that the things that we're doing aren't quite hitting the mark. And I want to state at the outset that while the vast majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children grow up in their families and communities, we do see this worrying increase in the number of our kids in the out-of-home care system. And I really think that there are two parts to that particular problem. First is that as the Families Culture Report in New South Wales made very clear, there's a profound and early overrepresentation of First Nations kids coming into contact with the child protection system. So the first big factor is the failure to address the structural drivers that brings kids into contact with the child protection system. Issues like poverty and housing insecurity, physical and mental health of families, substance misuse, issues that are in many ways linked to intergenerational experiences of trauma, of social marginalisation, of economic marginalisation, and of forced removals. The second element, I think, is when child protection systems do get involved about our kids, what we tend to see is that the overrepresentation increases as you move through the systems. So the system's response is less well suited, is less effective at diverting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families from more intrusive options like out-of-home care. So they're just, not only do we have more kids falling into the system as a result of structural drivers, but then when systems do respond, they're less well suited to responding in effective ways that prevent our kids from entering into those intrusive options like out-of-home care.
Richard, not only are the numbers of our children in out-of-home care increasing, the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children being placed with First Nations carers is decreasing. What explains this trend and why is it such an important issue from your perspective and the work that you're doing?
Well, it's important because of the high numbers of our children represented in out-of-home care. The preference is that they should be in the care of Aboriginal people, whether it's if they can't be in their family, but in within their kinship structure, that would be the strongest preference, and that's what the Aboriginal Child Placement Principle is about. Is really trying to support children that do have to be removed to be in a place where they're culturally safe, their identity is honoured and strengthened, and that they remain connected to their family and culture. But as Paul just outlined, there is a range of issues in this system that just aren't working well for Aboriginal people. So things like poor family finding practices. We have a range of Aboriginal community-controlled organisations in the system providing out-of-home care, and they do a great job. But many of our children are in the care of mainstream organisations, and they don't have the cultural knowledge, the cultural connections that our organisations and communities do. Many carers are overlooked or ignored when they apply to become part of that child's care. And there are a range of other complexities in the system around probity checks. So some people, when people take on care of a child, everyone in the household has to meet a Working with Children's check accreditation or a clearance, and not everybody can do that. So there's a whole bunch of things that come together and create problems with the system that we've got. But I think what Paul was just in his last answer, I think what he's telling us, or what I'm seeing, is that we have a system that doesn't work for Aboriginal children and Aboriginal people. So we have a system that is primarily driven by reporting and assessments of risk, which are not based in our culture, that they're based on a westernised view of the world. And it doesn't recognise the history of our people. So Paul mentioned trauma and intergenerational impacts of that, and other issues like poverty. Now, those things have come to us through the history of this country, and until we have a recognition of that and the impacts it's having today, then we can't really see a system is unable to respond to that. So we have our kids, our communities, families trying to fit into a system or work with a system that doesn't meet their needs. So what it's telling us is we need a different system. We need a different way of working with vulnerable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and families at risk, that provide approaches that address issues like trauma, that address issues of complexity around where therapeutic intervention's needed, but also supports families that are vulnerable and at risk, that doesn't just oppose a punitive approach onto them, but supports them, wraps mechanisms and services around them that will help them keep their children in their families.
I'd love to bring you in on this now, Catherine, just to get your thoughts on what's been said, but also what you, from your perspective and experience, understand that the impact is on First Nations children who grow up away from their culture.
Yeah, what I find fascinating about all of this, and certainly really reinforces it when I'm listening to what Richard is saying, is that as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we are actually born into this incredible infrastructure of culture and this incredibly sophisticated framework that enabled us to support our children without any interventions. We're born to multiple mothers and fathers, and we don't belong to an identity, to a parent or a mother and father. We belong to our communities, we belong to our families. And that meant that once upon a time, not so very long ago, and certainly still in practice today for our mob who aren't too disrupted, is that we can move within the framework of that extended family. It's nothing to go to your other mother's house and know that there is dinner provided for you. Your care is disseminated. There was a recognition that sometimes in the world you might need to be able to move within the boundaries of an extended family, and that family is not, that sort of framework is often diminished in in what we see today. You know, it is not recognised for how sophisticated it is and how valid it is. It's considered other instead of actually, no, you know what, this is one of the most sophisticated childcare frameworks ever known to mankind. It wasn't until non-Indigenous people turned up and said, hey, let's take your kids off you and let's show you how you really should be doing this, that we encountered these types of problems. So being connected to your culture is fundamentally important. And it is certainly one of the things that, one of the instruments of colonisation, and why colonisation is effective, because what it does is it comes in and it disconnects you from your culture. It says you can no longer speak your languages, you can no longer practice your laws. It's our way, and here's the school that will teach you how to become like us, how to assimilate us. And as we know, we've resisted this, and we've resisted this because Aboriginal people are intrinsically connected to this country in a different way. You know, and this is something that we're born into. We are born intrinsically connected, and even those mob that have no longer that suffer the disruption of colonisation, they know that there is mob around them. They know that the land talks to them, and they know that there are spirits out there that we need to be able to connect to. And what we find is that as we grow, it's our stories and access to language, even if it's only just the word or two, or just the inflection in our accents and our cadence and our rhythms that get passed down. You know, these things have been passed down for centuries. What an incredible history for our children to hold. What an incredible history to grow up with and to be proud of. And I think one of the most important tools Snake uses in celebrating this and reminding our families of how important it is, and what an important role that they play in being able to cultivate culture and connect their families, is National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children's Day. And of course that's celebrated on the 4th of August, and that date is really, really important because that was the day attributed and assigned to members of the stolen generation when they took them away and had no idea what day they were born on. And that's the day where we say never again will, as children, you have to be told that your culture wasn't valued, that your connection to your families weren't valued, that you don't belong to one of the most awesome cultures in the whole world, and certainly the oldest culture in the whole world. So it is incredibly vital that our children remain connected. We know that their outcomes are different, their well-being is better, they do better in the education system, they're likely to have impacts and contacts with child protection or juvenile justice systems. So the evidence is overwhelming. If you can keep us there, if you can keep us within the framework of how we know how to raise children successfully, you know, there is a very, very bright future for our children, and they grow up proud and they grow up strong. And this is an awesome thing to be able to do.
Richard, coming off the back of that very powerful articulation by Catherine about the importance of family and culture and country to us, I wonder if you can give us a bit of an overview. When you were at the Healing Foundation, you led some really groundbreaking work in deepening our understanding about the concept of intergenerational trauma. And I wonder if you could just share with us what we now understand about that.
Well, we understand that it's particularly for stolen generations, but many others in our communities, that those impacts have been profound, they've been long-lasting, and they've created challenges that are still with us today. They've not only, trauma and the practices of removal and the trauma it created, it happened across communities. It didn't happen. It wasn't an ad hoc process. It was a systematic process. It was part of, a history of control and a history of genocide and a whole range of things that have been done to Aboriginal people. And those impacts are felt from one generation to the next, and they keep impacting on us today. And even though we've seen, the idea of the stolen generation, so the Protection Acts that enabled all of those repealed through the 70s, we still see our children being removed. So the history of removal continues. But we know that if our people don't have an opportunity to heal, then trauma just keeps playing out in our lives, and it's a cycle of trauma, and it's an intergenerational impact. So creating opportunities for children, for families, for communities to heal is going to be really important going forward. And look, unfortunately, we have a child protection system that isn't going to be enabled to do that. It just doesn't have the concept of how important culture is. And I think the way Catherine just described how important it is for children to be connected to their culture, I've never heard anything like that come from any bureaucrat that operates in the system. So, and it's such it's a thing that the system can't do. It can't apply this cultural lens to the needs of our people and the needs of our children. And until we get, more of that, we see more of our children cared for by Aboriginal organisations or within kinship arrangements, where those are strengthened within an existing system. But also that we hopefully are moving to create a different type of system that will prevent our children from being removed from family, community and culture, and it will support people to heal so that we don't have this growing number of children in care. Because if we don't do something that has Aboriginal people at the centre, so really strong community engagement, strong involvement of families, a strong community control sector, we know the data tells us that we're going to see this trajectory of overrepresentation of our kids in care continue, and probably double in the next 10 years if nothing's done about it.
Paul, we've focused on some of the systemic challenges and perhaps failures in the process of actually removing children from families. But what can you tell us about what focus there is on prevention and reunification? So stopping that happening in the first place, and once children have had to be removed for whatever reason, making sure they get back to their families.
Yeah, and I think the conversation that sort of Richard has just laid out for us about the need for healing for our families, and I think prevention and reunification services are a key part of that, supporting our families to heal and interrupting that intergenerational cycle. And while we've seen more talk about that in recent years, in practice and through systems, we don't see enough focus on prevention and reunification. So prevention is one of the key elements of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle. But the investment in those family supports that are needed are just not there. And they're often poorly directed when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. And while this gets raised in review after review, we tend to see the proportion of investment nationally directed to family support slowly falling year on year. So nationally, governments spend about 4 times as much on care services as they do on supports for families each year. And I suppose with that sort of investment split, it probably shouldn't be that surprising to us that the number of kids in out-of-home care keeps growing. And then for Aboriginal families, even when we do have that investment, it tends to be invested in non-Indigenous approaches and models. And these tend to not be as effective for our families. They tend to have lower engagement, poorer completion, and are just not as well able to connect with our families and to help them make the changes that are needed and address those structural drivers of risk that many families face. So, and then with respect to restoration, and this was something that the Families Culture Report really looked at in great detail. And what they found was, in the majority of the cases that they reviewed, restoration was not even considered. And the review formed this view that restoration was a possibility in far more cases, but it wasn't given that chance. And then sadly, even when restoration is considered, the review found that often the goals were deficient, not aligned to the sorts of issues or the needs of families, but just sort of presenting hoops for families to jump through. And then in over a third of the cases, there was no actual casework to assist parents towards achieving those restoration goals. So these are families who are dealing with often entrenched challenges, and we know that they need supports to achieve them. But in a large proportion of those cases, they were not getting any support. So, in both family support and restoration, there's just such there's a huge need for a much greater focus and for greater service delivery through our community organisations to deliver families the tailored supports that they need.
I want to just talk about, a couple of moments that were perhaps seen as game changers in this space. Of course, the national apology delivered by Kevin Rudd in 2008 and of the Bringing Them Home report, which was delivered in 1997. Just to start with that moment of the apology, Catherine, what was the impact of that apology on you personally? And when you look back on it now, what has been its longer legacy?
Look, I remember the day, actually. I do remember the day, and I was supposed to be doing a live cross. NITV News had just come online, and I was supposed to do a live cross, and I had to give it to my brother Ryan to do, and I'm so glad I did that. In hindsight, I'm so glad I did that because he can remember being in the moment as that was broadcast to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people through that national Indigenous channel. It meant that someone like me who was at home with a sick kid could actually sit back and watch it and think about what that would have meant to my grandfather in particular, because my grandfather, like many members of my family, was a member of the stolen generation. And I think if he'd have heard that, he'd have sat there and cried. He really would have. And I have told this story before, but, when that old man was very, very ill, he'd just been recovering from having his stomach removed and his throat removed. And this man has never complained about anything in his life. He just took everything on his chin. He made sure that he provided homes for children that didn't have them and really was committed to making sure no one would have to deal with the traumas that he'd had to grow up with. And what I find really significant about that is on his deathbed, as he knows that he's going to die, what he wanted to share with us was that the person that removed him, that bastard, had blue eyes. And I always think of that because I think at 80 years of age, as you know you're dying, the one thing you want everyone to know is that bastard had blue eyes. So when I watched that is what it reminded me of. It reminded me that right now it might sound like a really small thing to say sorry, but for people like my grandfather, it would have meant the world. So that is how I think of that day, and every day, every time it comes around, I think about how it would have felt to hear those words and how it was absolutely vital as a first step to start that reparation journey for those mob feeling those traumas and those of us that carry those stories and those traumas that have been passed on through our families that were subjected to it.
You're listening to Speaking Out. I'm Larissa Behrendt, and my guests this evening are Richard Weston, Paul Gray and Catherine Little. Paul, the Bringing Them Home report had a key recommendation around self-determination. How important is that as a guiding principle today in terms of adopting recommendations? And I guess one thing that always comes up in this space is how important the community-controlled sector is. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the simple answer to that, Larissa, is that the importance of self-determination in this sector is can't be overestimated. It's such a critical foundation of transforming child protection systems and changing the trajectory of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families who continue to be affected by them. International research shows time and time again that when decisions are made by First Nations communities, outcomes are better. It doesn't matter if you're talking about healthcare, if you're talking about social service provision, environmental management. When First Nations communities are empowered to make their own decisions, they deliver better outcomes for their communities. And we saw that in the review of the last decade of Closing the Gap, I think. I mean, Richard sort of pointed to some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities of it. And I think when we sort of look back at the 10 years, when communities had been empowered to drive their own solutions on issues, progress was made in those locations. And this is research that's mirrored everywhere across the world. And in fact, most societies like ours, if we're looking at the United States, if we're looking at Canada, if we're looking at New Zealand, are exploring ways that they can change their systems and change their legislative frameworks to empower local communities in controlling these systems. Aboriginal community-controlled organisations are a part of that community infrastructure that's needed to actually realise community-led approaches in this space. And so, again, they're a key part of that transformation of systems because they're best placed. They know their communities. They know that the needs of their families. They carry the aspirations of their communities. And so they're best placed to tailor the sorts of services that families need, whether that's early intervention and supports, whether that's intensive family supports for families who are experiencing crisis, or addressing the needs of their kids who, for whatever reason, for a period of time, can't remain at home. And really, self-determination, I think, along with public accountability are the two things that recent reviews like Family is Culture pointed at, and they're key building blocks of the Family Matters campaign in terms of how do we fundamentally transform these systems and how do we reorient them towards prevention and early support to addressing the structural drivers of risk and responding more effectively. Because ultimately what we do know is that overall, kids do better when they're with their families. We know that culture is a protective factor that fosters resilience for our kids, and that connections to family, to community, to culture, to country underpin the social and emotional well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, both now and into the future. So we know that outcomes for our kids and our peoples will be improved when communities make their own decisions, and we need to use that as the sort of lever to transform these systems to deliver better for our kids.
Catherine, a moment ago, Richard mentioned that there has been a reboot of the Close the Gap agenda, and it now includes an indicator around the child protection space. From your perspective, what difference will this make, especially since child protection is actually treated as a state issue for the most part, but we now have a national benchmark on it?
Yeah, well, how amazing, hey? And I think that is one of the beauties of how the coalition has been successful in negotiating the framework, is that it said, hang on, this is about joint responsibility. This isn't about the states and territories alone, and this isn't about the Commonwealth alone, and this isn't just about us alone. If we're going to have any chance of changing this trajectory, and the trajectory is horrific. You know, we're currently looking at 42% of the children out of home care are ours. 42%. We represent less than 3% of the population, and that stat will, if uninterrupted, will double by 2030. So, you know, there's something really fundamentally needs to shift. So what it enables us to do is work with the Commonwealth to develop the overarching plan, because the Commonwealth has the dollars. And in working with the Commonwealth alongside them in the vision for what do we call it, the National National Plan for Protecting Australia's Children. If we get that right, it will have the structural drivers in it that will enable the states and territories to be flexible and to be responsive, but more importantly, that focuses on the need for self-determination, for early intervention, and looks at the underlying structural drivers in a systemic way. So these are big, grand visions, and certainly anyone negotiating that plan at the moment has a headache. I can assure you, it's not only us with the headaches. As governments flex and change and understand what we mean when we talk about joint responsibility, not the Commonwealth's responsibility, not the states and territories' responsibility, but everyone's responsibilities and everyone's accountabilities, and how you stay accountable so that it's not just Aboriginal people who are told it is your fault that this has happened. It is about government stepping up and saying, hey, this is where that process went wrong, and this is how we're going to change it, and this is how we monitor it together.
Does sound like it's a space where ambition is needed. In terms of looking at levers for change and strategies for change, Richard, what does your role as Deputy Children's Guardian for Aboriginal children and young people in New South Wales entail? It's a new role, and what difference can roles like these make?
Thanks, Larissa. Look, the role's been created, it's been framed by the government, the New South Wales government, as a response to the Families Culture Report. And I'm based with the Office of the Children's Guardian. So my role is to lead the organisation's regulatory work in promoting and regulating the quality of out-of-home care, and also child-safe organisations. There's some legislation going through Parliament at the moment to institute child safe standards onto the child protection system, and the OCG will be administering those and applying those. And that's and the reason I was given those areas of responsibility by the OCG is that they're the ones that have the most impacts on Aboriginal children and young people. So I think it's I'm hopeful the role can obviously can make a difference, but can make, accountability stronger to meeting things like the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle. There's another policy that's been on the books for quite a while now, for a few years, the Aboriginal case management policy. And both of those policies and initiatives acting together, I think, can make a difference to how Aboriginal children in the system are treated and cared for. A key part of my role, as I see it, is that engagement with the Aboriginal community, and not just around providing a response to the Families Culture pieces of work, but in an ongoing way, and how that engagement with the community can strengthen accountability, but strengthen our people's understanding of how the system works, so that there can be more focus on strengthening families. Communities can be empowered to become more involved in the system, particularly around issues like the child placement principle, finding carers, all of those kind of things that we've talked about. But it's a challenging environment to be in, but I'm also really hoping to build good working relationships with the Department of Communities and Justice. They are responding to the Families Culture Report, and there's a lot of activity going on as they work to improve their own systems, but trying to keep an eye on that will be an important role here, I think. So that's why I want to have an ongoing eyes on the implementation of the Families Culture Review. But so there's opportunities in this role. It's probably not, there was a threshold in the I think in the Families Culture Review which called for an overhaul of the child protection system. But it's up to governments to make those decisions, and where, if there's an appetite for that kind of change. But I think there are things that are happening now, like Catherine talked about closing the gap. I think it's a different type of agreement than what we had before. All governments have signed up to it, including local government, and there is a lot of activity going on within government to try and plan, to try and work out how they're going to respond and meet the targets, because there's more than just the child protection target. There's 16 other targets. I think there's quite a few. So I think it is changing that trying to reset that relationship between Aboriginal people and government. And I think in New South Wales, it's critically important because 1/3 of all children in out-of-home care nationally are in New South Wales. So getting it right in New South Wales is really important to closing the gap nationally.
Well, we're very lucky that we've got someone with your experience and expertise in the role. If anyone can make it work, it's you. Paul, obviously another thing that's worth looking at in terms of strategies going forward is the Family Matters campaign. Can you just tell us what it's trying to achieve and what are your key areas of focus as co-chair of the leadership group and then, of course, how people can get involved?
Yeah, thanks, Larissa, and it's great that I can be on this in this conversation with my other co-chair. I want to acknowledge Catherine Little, who is the other co-chair, and also acknowledge Richard, who was a previous co-chair. So it's been a long-running campaign, and really its aim is quite simple. It's about ending the overrepresentation of our kids in child protection systems by 2040. So it sets a big challenge to our nation in terms of addressing and ending this particular area of inequity that I suppose is created and maintained through both past and present policy settings. And as we've talked about, we've got a lot of work to do to turn that trajectory around. And listening to both Richard and Catherine reflect on the national apology, I suppose, made me think of the part that I've always taken away from that apology was that it urged the country to embrace new solutions to enduring problems where old approaches have failed. And that's certainly the case in child protection. And the Family Matters campaign is, I suppose, tries to provide a roadmap for that reform to embrace new approaches. It's oriented around key principles, our building blocks, which are things like ensuring access to quality, culturally safe, universal and targeted supports for our families and our kids, ensuring that our families and that our communities participate in and have control over the decisions that affect them, that law, policy and practice are culturally safe and responsive, and that governments and services are accountable to our communities. The Family Matters campaign does a couple of activities. So each year the report outlines, each year the campaign releases a report which outlines key developments in the space nationally and key statistics, and it produces a report card for how each state and territory is going against those building blocks. It's a solutions-focused campaign, and we're trying to, through that report, increase accountability. It also provides a key opportunity to raise issues. So in the past, we've raised issues about how permanency is understood and our concerns about third-party orders, like as they're called in New South Wales, guardianship, but third-party orders generally, guardianship and adoption, and the risks that they potentially present to our kids. We've had conversations about birth alerts and acknowledging that 1 in 5 Aboriginal kids who enter care each year are under the age of 1, and really wanting to push for new approaches in that area. And we've also talked a lot about the need for a national commissioner to provide oversight in the similar roles to what Richard and others in other jurisdictions are doing. So there's some of the things that we've been focused on. And if people want to get involved, look, I would suggest that people jump online and have a look at our website, www.familymatters.org.au. And there's lots of information about who's part of our Coalition for Change there, who our supporters are, some of our current initiatives. You can also get in touch with Snake, who lead the campaign, or reach out to community-controlled organisations or peaks in your particular state or territory, many of whom are connected with the national campaign.
I feel like we've been so privileged this evening to be hearing from the three of you with the importance of the work you're doing and your extensive knowledge on this really complex and difficult set of issues. And I'm mindful of the time, and honestly, I could have you on for a whole other hour. But I just wondered, just to finish off tonight, if I could just give you a chance for sort of a final reflection, and maybe just perhaps share with us something that you've seen in the space that you know actually works in terms of us thinking forwardly about more solutions in the space. And I might start with you, Richard.
Yeah, great question. I think, I think it's already been said about, Aboriginal organisations being involved, community being engaged, families being engaged, so mechanisms that facilitate that. But there's a piece of work going on down on the south coast with an organisation called Waminda, and it's the Naboo Project, and that is... Look, Waminda's an amazing organisation. They have they've been around for 30, 40 years, and they've just have an amazingly strong cultural foundation that underpins all their work. But the Naboo Project is about working with children that are at risk, and mothers and families that are at risk of having their children removed, and ensuring that those children stay with their families. And they use a very strong cultural approach. They have a very flexible team. And, they are well supported by through funding from DCJ. So they are really being looked at as one of those beacon projects or beacon opportunities that could perhaps lead to more extensive change through the system. But, what's at the heart of it is Aboriginal culture, the strengths of Aboriginal culture, cultural understandings, keeping families connected to their culture and identity, and keeping children connected to their culture and identity, and working in a way that supports them and supports people to address issues like trauma, give families the opportunity to heal, and those are the things that I think make a difference, and they're the things that I've seen. And as Paul said, he outlined, he talked about the evidence that whenever First Nations people are involved in finding their own solutions, we get better outcomes. And that's what I've seen over my career. Every time Aboriginal people are involved in either designing or delivering a service, we get better outcomes. And that's a sort of the underlying principle about how we can make this system, this change for our children and our families. So, and culture, that cultural lens is really important.
Thank you. And what about you, Paul? What are your thoughts?
No, I think mine are in the same direction there, Larissa. I think it's really about what can happen when our communities lead. And I think one of the really shining lights for me is the whole story of the Family as Culture report. If it wasn't for Grandmothers Against Removals here in New South Wales, who really led the charge, then we wouldn't have had the Family as Culture report. And then likewise, the Family as Culture report was led by a very strong Aboriginal woman. And so I think it's and reflecting on what Richard's just said about Naboo down there, and the team down there have very strong Aboriginal women at the forefront. So I think for me, when Aboriginal communities are leading the way, and particularly our strong Aboriginal women, then I think we can see really innovative, we can see great approaches that push at the boundaries of what is currently there and find new ways to tackle this problem. I'm really excited by some of the developments, for example, in Victoria with delegated authority, where we see Aboriginal community organisations making decisions, which is kind of following on from some of those great approaches internationally that we see in the US and Canada. So, certainly with Aboriginal communities at the forefront, we can see really innovative approaches to this space that will change those trajectories for our kids.
Great thoughts. And with that lovely shout out you did to the strength of our Aboriginal women, it feels very appropriate that we're giving Catherine the last word here. What are your thoughts, Catherine?
I reckon I've got three, right? And one is about women, and that is, historically we know that care for our children, that's grandmother's law. And what's fundamental in that grandmother's law that I outlined earlier is caring. That's what's at the heart of how we understand the need to support our families and to give our families the space to grow and to create the opportunities for our children to thrive. It's caring. So that's my first thought on it. The second thought is, of course, we are dealing with a system that failed to engage the people that the system was applied to. So it is about creating the space for people to step into. And my experience has always been, when you remove the barriers, when you create the space, those people who understand what's impacting on them do come up with innovative solutions and effective solutions. And in line with what Paul was just talking about, the evidence coming out of Victoria that VACA is starting to collect is showing that where their Aboriginal-led programs and guardianship are in place, they're seeing more rehoming of our children with their families at a faster rate. They're seeing less interventions because the teams that are dealing with these families on the ground, well, they're our teams. So they naturally understand and intuitively understand how to communicate with each other. They also understand the environments that they're working with and the impacts of transgenerational trauma when you're talking to people who are having a hard time of it. And we're also sort of seeing that out of Queensland as well. And I know I said I had a third, but I can't remember what it is now. It was a really good one. But look, I think that, actually I do. This is the really good one, right? So Snake is in its 40th year, and it is an incredible example of what happens when our mob identify the need for something, and it is our community that built this peak 40 years ago, and it's undergone a lot of challenges, including the defunding in that notorious 2016 budget. And it's still here. And the reason Snake is still here is because our community said, hang on, our children are important, and it doesn't matter what you take away from us, we will find a way for this body to stay at the table. And if it hadn't stayed at the table, then those incredible targets, like reducing the number of children in out-of-home care by 45%, wouldn't be on the national radar right now. And that was our mob.
But I just want to thank all three of you. It's so amazing to hear you speak. I just admire the work you do, as you know, and such a privilege to be able to get your voices to be able to put on the show. So thank you so much for your time and for all the work you do. I think all three of you are amazing. So thank you so much. So, Paul, tell us about restoration.
So, and then with respect to restoration, and this was something that the Families Culture Report really looked at in great detail. And what they found was, in the majority of the cases that they reviewed, restoration was not even considered. And the review formed this view that restoration was a possibility in far more cases, but it wasn't given that chance. And then sadly, even when restoration is considered, the review found that often the goals were deficient, not aligned to the sorts of issues or the needs of families, but just sort of presenting hoops for families to jump through. And then in over a third of the cases, there was no actual casework to assist parents towards achieving those restoration goals. So these are families who are dealing with often entrenched challenges, and we know that they need supports to achieve them. But in a large proportion of those cases, they were not getting any support. So, in both family support and restoration, there's just such there's a huge need for a much greater focus and for greater service delivery through our community organisations to deliver families the tailored supports that they need.
Well, thank you so much for being with us this evening and taking the time to share your insights into what is a complex and challenging issue. And we really want to thank and acknowledge you for all the work you're doing in this really important space. My guests tonight have been co-chair of the Family Matters National Leadership Group, Dr. Paul Gray, Deputy Children's Guardian for Aboriginal Children and Young People in New South Wales, Richard Weston, and CEO of Snake, Catherine Little. That's the show for this week. Join us again next week when we highlight the importance and prominence of First Nations literature. Speaking Out is on Facebook, and you can email the program speakingout@abc.net.au. We would love to hear from you. I'm Larissa Behrendt, and this is Speaking Out.